Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward." Then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him to destroy him. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, I don't know in your life what's like the worst encounter you've ever had with a rule. You know, maybe this would be something if you stick around for coffee to have a conversation with someone else about the worst encounter you ever had with a rule that you thought was either a bad rule or one that was badly enforced. I can tell you that I stand before you as a convict. I was convicted in high school student court. What happened was there was a rule that said that you could not eat on campus unless you were in the cafeteria. And I was caught on the sidewalk outside the door with a lifesaver in my mouth. And I was summoned to student court where I was pronounced guilty and sentenced to 2 days of detention. My high school was strict. I was sentenced to 2 days of detention for having a lifesaver in my mouth on the grounds other than in the cafeteria. For nearly 50 years, I have carried this shame. But I confess it to you now that I, too, have had someone say, "Guilty." And sometimes we wrestle with stupid rules. Sometimes we wrestle with stupid enforcement of the rules, okay? And Jesus is talking about a rule today that we've all heard about, right? Where he says to them, where the Pharisees say to him, "Look, why are your disciples doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Now, I don't know how you were raised. Now, my family was not particularly strict about Sabbath. So some of you may have been raised in families, though, where your family was really strict about Sabbath observance. Like, a quick show of hands. How many of you were raised in a family where Sabbath observance was pretty strict? Okay, just a few. That was like at the 9 o'clock service. It was just a few. My family was not. Although I know of people who Sabbath came around, Sunday, man, they were not allowed to do anything. They were not allowed to go out and play. They were not allowed to do anything, but be really, strict, good, Sabbath-observing people. Now, Jesus counters this question with an example. And he gives them an example out of 1 Samuel. This is actually from the first book of Samuel, chapter 21, is the story that Jesus is referring to. And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food?" They went to the house of God. He entered the house of God. And when Abiathar was high priest, and they ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and he gave some to his companions. Now, the bread of the presence is this special loaf in the temple. So the house of God is a euphemism for the temple. So there's a loaf there, a loaf of bread that was set aside symbolically for God. Okay, so this bread is there for God, and if they removed it, it had to be replaced by another hot loaf that was there for God. And so only the priests were then allowed to eat it. So the idea was the high priest would have this loaf there, it's symbolically there for God. God somehow was never hungry, and so it was always there. And then they would replace it with a hot loaf, and then the priests could eat it. And David, in this story, just goes and says, we're hungry. Now, the important thing here is also that they're not dying. Okay, they're not starving. All right? He just is hungry and says, do you have any bread? And the high priest is like, the only bread we've got is this. And so he's like, well, how about that? Okay? And you can imagine the consternation, around this story. It would be very similar. Like, imagine if someone walked in right now and said, see that bread? I'd like a sandwich. There might be considerable debate in how you would feel about that. Some of you would go, wait a second, that's communion bread. And others might say, wait, a person wants a sandwich. Which is the higher use of that bread? For me to have it to ceremonially break it later? Or is a higher use of that bread to feed someone who'd like a sandwich? Okay? I think most of you would actually come up, how about the third way? I'll run to ShopRite. And get the person that. But so somehow people, you could have two very different views of how this bread ought to be used. So he wants them to think. He wants them to think about this rule that they're accusing him of breaking. And he's using examples that they would know from Scripture. And one of the things that happens when we're thinking about rules is that too often we emphasize knowing the rule versus understanding the rule. There are too many people who know the rule, but they don't really understand it. We tend to encounter this when we call our cable company for service. You will encounter, you encounter people who know the rules, but it doesn't seem like they really understand the rules. And that's when we end up getting like really bad customer service. Somebody who knows the rules, but they don't really understand them. So Jesus is starting to explain the thinking behind the rule to the people, and he tells them something that we all have heard. We've heard this 70 million times in our lives, but just remember that 2,000 years ago, this was new. All right? When Jesus says the Sabbath was made for humankind, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath, this was new teaching to them. They didn't understand this. They thought that the point was that God needed the worship. God needed this from us. And Jesus is saying, no, wait a second. You don't serve Sabbath. Sabbath serves you. God doesn't need you to observe Sabbath. You need to observe Sabbath. You need the Sabbath. It's not God. It's about what you need. All right? And you need to understand why this rule exists. It exists for what you need, not for what God needs. And one of the things that always has to happen when we come up against rules is we need to remember that rules are an expression of a principle. We start with a principle. We start with something that we're trying to achieve, and then we develop rules that help us feed the principle. They help us serve the principle, okay? But you always have to remember what the principle is. It's not about the rules. Now, we need rules because sometimes it's difficult for people to gauge the principle. For example, you put rules around what a young child can do because the young child doesn't really understand the principle. So you tell the young child, be safe, and then you have to give them a rule because they don't really understand that involves like not crossing a street with heavy traffic, things like that. So you have to give them a rule so that they can understand, so that they are able to implement the principle. But what matters is the principle, not the rule. But these folks don't get it. And so there's Jesus in the synagogue, the next time he's there, there's a person there who had a withered hand. And by the way, it's really important to note what the person was afflicted by, because it was not a violation of the Sabbath rules to save a life. Okay, so you could save a life on the Sabbath. And so it was important that what the person was afflicted with was something that could wait. So he's not going to die of this withered hand. In fact, that was often one of the criticisms levied at Jesus was, why today? Tell him to come back tomorrow. All right? It's not a necessity to do it today. But here, what's happened is that not only do you have this potential rules violation, but they have weaponized the rule. They have weaponized the rule with the idea that they are going to catch him doing it. And instead, he goes back at them by challenging their reasoning behind the enforcement of the rule. He says, look, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? Is it lawful to save life or to kill? And here he's putting in a stretch, because their argument would be, wait a second, of course, our Sabbath rule says that you can save life on the Sabbath. All right, they already know this. And you're not saving his life. You're just healing an injured hand. But he's like, wait a second. You see, this is what Jesus is trying to tell them is that, wait a second. See, what you're looking at is the black and white of the rule. What you're looking at is the specifics of, yes, you can save a life on the Sabbath. And what you're not understanding is the principle that lies underneath the rule. The principle that lies underneath the rule about helping versus hurting. Is it lawful to do good or to do harm? And by taking it out of the realm of the black and white literal reading of the rule itself, he's taken the rule and he's turned it into a matter of discretion. He's turned it into a matter of judgment. And what rules do is they replace judgment in the furtherance of a principle. All right? And so rules sit there and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to define things specifically rather than just use your judgment. For instance, traffic laws, which we all love. But we'd be worse off without them. Right? Traffic laws are there for the purpose of keeping people safe. Right? That's why they exist. However, what they end up doing is they end up putting in specifics so that it's not just a judgment call. So you have engineers and whatever who sit there and decide that safe on this road means 30 miles an hour, and safe on this road means 40 miles an hour, and safe on this road means 50 miles an hour. The underlying principle is the same. The underlying principle is that you are to drive safely, but we're going to help define it for you by giving you very specific rules. And then on top of that, they do give police officers the extra out, which is that if you haven't violated any specific rule, they do have the ability to give you a ticket for quote-unquote unsafe driving. Right? It's the catch-all. It's okay, you didn't violate any specific rule, but I'm just going to nab you because I'm going to say that what you did was unsafe. Because the key principle is safety. And so what happens is that we have these sets of rules, but the rules are there to serve the principles. And so the key to getting better is not to know the rules in more detail. The key to getting better is to focus on the principles. The key to getting better in life is focusing on understanding what the principles are rather than the rules. If you understand what the principles are, then the rules start to become more obvious. But you have to spend a lot of time dissecting the principles. Now, most famous rules we have in faith, one of them is what we talked about today, right? It's the 10 Commandments. So those are the most famous rules that we have in faith. When you're a little kid, they teach you, here are the 10 basic rules of faith. And today Jesus is talking about the Sabbath command. And I just want to talk to you for a few minutes about how in our faith tradition they've dissected what seems to be a very simple rule and turned it into a much more complicated principle. And it's the eighth commandment. Thou shalt not steal. All right, now, if I ask you, what does it mean to obey thou shalt not steal? Most of you would just say, don't take someone else's stuff. All right? And if I sat there and said, well, what's the principle behind it? People have a right to their stuff. Okay, what more is there behind it? But actually, in our faith tradition, they spend a lot more time thinking about what the principles are behind these rules. And it's not just don't take stuff. So what I'm going to read to you from is from a set of documents. It was called the Westminster Standards, which were developed in our faith tradition in 1647. So, it's nearly 400 years ago. So understand that when they were dissecting what does it mean, thou shalt not steal, nearly 400 years ago, when you hear this, you may hear overtones that you would relate to modern political discourse, but understand that in the year 1647, words like capitalism, socialism, communism did not yet exist. All right, none of the people who pioneered those doctrines were born yet. Okay, so this thinking, this line of thought in 1647 predates all of our modern economic theories. All right, they're just approaching this completely theologically. It has nothing to do with modern competing theories of what kind of economic system you should have. And in 1647, I'm not going to read you the whole thing because it's really long. This was just a line from what they said is one of your duties under the eighth commandment. Because if I said, what are your duties under the eighth commandment, most of you, again, would just answer, don't steal anyone's stuff. What other duty is there? This was one of them. Giving and lending freely according to our abilities and the necessities of others. That giving and lending freely according to your ability to give or lend and according to the necessity that other people have was considered a part of your duty under the eighth commandment. In other words, what it's saying is that withholding from one in need when you have the ability to give or lend is stealing. Nervous yet? Anybody not nervous? Kind of nervous. Okay, all right. That one makes me sweat a little bit. All right. And then it goes on and says that on top of this duty is this: to endeavor by all just and lawful means to procure, preserve, and further the wealth and outward estate of others as well as our own. In other words, not only do you have a duty to give and lend to those in need based on your ability, you have a duty to increase your ability and the ability of others. You have a duty to help people earn so that they would be in a position to give or lend, to help people earn so that they would not be in a position of need. You have a duty to improve your own position to be able to give or lend. How many of you have ever said, I would love to give, but I don't have the means? This is saying part of your duty is actually to increase your means so that you can give, so that you can be as generous as you would want to be. And what happens is you come to understand that the underlying principle of all of this was that what God desired was economic justice for people. That what God desired, their understanding of what God desired, was that there be a way for everyone to be able to give or receive as they would need, to have the duty to increase your wealth. And so this paragraph, by the way, is great because in modern economic terms, there's something there for capitalists and socialists. Right? Increase your wealth and give. All right? To do both. Right? And the idea is that all of that is subsumed into the notion of thou shalt not steal. That whenever we don't do our utmost to help everyone in the economic realm, then in some way, shape, or form, they're being stolen from. That's a high standard. That's a hard standard. It's an impossibly hard standard for us to execute perfectly. But that's one of the things about thinking about principles versus rules. Rules narrow our perspective into whether or not we are simply violating the rule. Principles broaden our view of what the rule is asking of us. The rule is not the entirety of the principle. The rule is simply a very specific example of what the principle is trying to achieve. What Westminster, by the way, says about Sabbath is not simply this, because again, it's a very long section. But what Westminster says about Sabbath is the purpose of Sabbath is not that it has anything to do with God needing you to spend a day focused on them. So it's not like God is sitting there saying, hey, I'm feeling kind of neglected. You haven't been paying enough attention to me. Right? That's not what it is. But rather, what they said is simply this. And they ascribe the frequency to God's wisdom. But they said, look, you need Sabbath. Because what happens to you without Sabbath, what happens to you during the week, is that your mind becomes occupied with, their phrase was, worldly business. Your mind becomes occupied by worldly business during the week. And you need a day where you disconnect from worldly business and reconnect with God. Right? Not just for that day, but so that it will carry forward into the rest of the week. And so what they basically said, I'm paraphrasing, is that if you skip Sabbath, you will forget God. If you skip Sabbath, then you'll be in the middle of the week, and your worldly business will simply totally consume you. It'll consume your mind, and you will have no thought left in your mind about what God wanted. And so the idea was not that you needed Sabbath to serve God so God would feel that you paid attention to God. The point was that you need Sabbath, you need a day every 7 so that you don't forget God in the other 6. That if you don't spend a day thinking about your relationship with God and withdrawing from the worldly business, then that will not carry through the week for you. And at some point during the week, you will have forgotten God entirely. And isn't that really what the purpose of our worship is? The purpose of our worship is not to have you come, punch a clock with God, and say, okay, God, I was there, give me my attendance star, but rather the idea is to hopefully spend some time reconnecting you with God, with reconnecting you with your faith, not so that you can say, hey, I was connected with my faith for 1 day out of 7, but rather that it would carry through the entire week, so that every day your faith was a part of your life. And then, as Westminster argued, over that time, the presence of God in your mind would start to fade because it would start to get obscured by the worldly business. And then by the time we get to Saturday, you should be thinking, I need a refill. I need a recharge. I need to get myself refocused on God before my next week happens. Because we know that happens in all of our relationships. We know that happens with all of our friendships, right? If you don't periodically reconnect with a friend, you slowly but surely begin to think about them less. What's the frequency? We don't know. Westminster said it was in God's divine wisdom that God ordained that the frequency would be 1 day out of 7. That God knew what was best for us. And so when Jesus is in the synagogue and he sees the people who are ready to pounce on him for healing this person with the withered hand, which he's about to do. It says that he was grieved at their hardness of heart, which is a Greek word that we might just as well translate as callousness. That he was grieved at their callousness because they couldn't see what undergirded the rule. They couldn't see that the very first principle that undergirds every rule that God gives us is that everything is for our good. That there is not a single rule given to us from God that is for God's benefit. Every rule that God gives us is for our benefit. Every time we're trying to understand why a rule exists or how should we honor the rule, the question we need to ask ourselves is really simple. Why is this good for me? Because that's what God wants. So the question is, how is obeying this rule good for me? And sometimes we have the attitude of children. When I was a child, I never understood why dessert should come last in a meal. All right? I really thought this was not a good rule. I mean, I'm hungriest, my taste buds are primed. Come on, lead with the cake, Mom. Lead with the cake. Okay? And so the rule I wanted wasn't the rule that was good for me. And so we often have to ask ourselves, when we're about to violate a rule that God has given us, the thinking that we need to run through is, hey, wait a second. Am I just deciding to have my dessert first? Am I just deciding to obey a rule where I sit there and say, what's the harm? But God actually knows what the harm is, and you actually know what the harm is. Okay. Or can you focus on simply saying, well, okay, before I decide about obeying this rule or not, I'm going to think about the simple question. Why is it good for me? And when you come to understand every rule that God gives you as being rooted in what is good for you, then you come to understand why obedience is good for you. That it's not about satisfying the whims of a capricious God, but rather it's simply about relying on God's wisdom to teach you what is good for you. And then we can obey not in a spirit of obligation, not in a spirit of being nitpicky about the rules, but we can obey in a spirit of understanding that I'm doing it because God knew that it was good for me to obey. Amen.